In 1870s Dublin, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a restless heart began to record his hopes, his longings, and his fears. Now those private pages lie open, the raw, unguarded thoughts of the man who would one day give us a monster. Let's explore the lost journal of Bram Stoker here on Things Visible and Invisible. Dacre Stoker is an internationally best-selling author. He is also the great-grand-nephew of Bram Stoker, author of Dracula. As well as managing the Bram Stoker estate, he has authored a number of vampire-inspired novels, as well as the non-fiction, The Lost Journal of Bram Stoker, The Dublin Years. And he joins me down the line from his home in South Carolina. Dacre, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you, Seán. It's my pleasure to be here.
Now, it's a great pleasure to have such an illustrious name on the show. We've had Bela Lugosi's descendants on the show, and now we've got Bram Stoker's descendants on the show. Before we get into all of the more serious side of your work and your research, Dacre, what was it like growing up knowing you were a descendant of the man who gave us Dracula?
Well, I grew up in Montreal, Canada, and of course, we celebrate the great tradition that Ireland sent over to Canada with Halloween. And around that time of the year, people would come to the door of our household going, "Ooh, the Stoker household, what's going to happen? Are you going to give us candy or take our blood?" And I, it was dumbfounding to me what they were talking about until about the age of 12 or 13 years old when I asked my dad, "What are they talking about?" And he said, "Well, son, it's time to show you." So he brought me to the family library and pulled out a first edition of Dracula, the one that's been passed on down from Bram to his mother, to one of the other brothers, and then to my dad, Desmond. And then he told me, he said, "Look, this is our famous relative who, wrote this novel." And this is back, in the late 60s. So it wasn't that big a deal for us, because many people knew Dracula, but not many people in those days knew Bram Stoker. And that all changed as I got more involved in writing my stories and digging deep into it. So at the beginning, it wasn't that big a deal, but it has become a bigger deal. And I take the responsibility seriously to try to actually help create the creation of Dracula, of Bram being Dracula, try to put some perspective to who the man was, so that the creator is somewhat on equal terms to his creation.
Well, I could absolutely concur with that, Dacre. In many years that I have been reading about and writing about occasionally the myth, the mythos of Dracula, the figure of Bram Stoker increasingly becomes more intriguing, if I can put it like that, than his creation. He's a man of many, many parts and many, many lives almost. But he's also a man who kind of eludes clear definition. I don't know if you mean. I've read a number of biographies on Bram Stoker. Is he a man that you feel you understand?
I do now. I feel I understand him very well after doing much what you have done. Read the biographies, take those in perspective, because some of them tend to get very sensational, to sell books. But since I found his journal in the Isle of Wight, and I found many letters back and forth between him and other key players in his life, and also found the Dracula typescript with certain things crossed out, and the Dracula notes, I have much better idea of who Bram was, what his life was like, and it is enlightening to understand this man who's given us, not just Dracula, but many other books in the supernatural that really reflected a sign of the times of when he lived, the late Victorian era in London, the theater manager that he was, that what he chose to put pen to paper about were certain situations with purpose, as you mentioned, that he was capitalizing on real fears, real issues and sensitivities, but he actually packaged his vampire novel in a way that nobody did before or after, in a way that made his Count Dracula arriving on the shores of Whitby in a very realistic format, which really scared the heck out of people.
Well, I'm sure you're familiar. I think it was Ernest Hemingway said it, that all fiction is ultimately autobiography. So I'm very interested to get into some of that with you, Dacre, in terms of my own ideas and your ideas of maybe what was going on inside Bram Stoker's head when he was writing his most famous novel. But as you say, there were other interesting books. But before we do that, I want to backtrack a little bit because I'm sure you're aware that in some of the biographies, Stoker's Irish background is either glossed over very quickly and then the move to London and all the rest of it, the more glamorous side of things. Other people then have sort of posited him as a kind of, in a sort of resurgent neo-Celtic romanticism of the 19th century in Ireland. You've studied this period of his life. The Lost Journal of Bram Stoker, The Dublin Years, is your creation on that. What conclusions have you come to about the Irish genesis of this man and indeed of Dracula?
Well, because there's no autobiography written, and that would have made it simple if we could actually, listen to what Bram had to say about himself and his Irish upbringing. That would be an easy answer, but it's not. So what we have to do is look at the circumstantial evidence and say, what was he leaning towards? What caught his eye? And by analyzing his Lost Journal, I could see that he was very interested and concerned about all matters around him. Growing up when he was a young boy in Clontarf, then at Trinity College, and then working at Dublin Castle. So he was very interested in the plight of the common man and woman, social issues that were going on at the time. But he was also interested in looking at life through a different lens. He was a bit of a dreamer. Even though he had that legal side of him, to me, there is this man somewhat conflicted between the detail-oriented side that was the clerk of the Petty Sessions Legal Department and later the inspector. He is Jonathan Harker, I have to tell you, Seán. There's no question he inserted himself in the novel this way, traveling around the country, making sure all the details of legal arrangements are correct, much like Jonathan Harker did going to Transylvania to make sure all Count Dracula's legal transactions for buying his properties in London were correct. But Bram was also an artist. He was a founding member of the Dublin Painting and Sketching Club. He won some awards as a young boy at the Dublin Hibernian Society, and he started writing prose and poetry and romanticism in this journal of his. So this was a man that sort of combined those things as he looked at life through the lens that really only a person who has this sort of duality side to his brain, looking at things as they are, but then creating them in a sensational manner so that it brings attraction to it. And even though he didn't write much in his notes about specific Irish folklore mythology, I believe he didn't need to, because it was already absorbed into him, all the stories he heard as a young boy of Irish folklore, their own versions of vampires, banshees, pukas, changelings, all these things that he didn't have to write down. What he wrote down were things he found in the books that he wasn't aware of and he had to remember. The Transylvanian superstitions, where it was Lady Jane Wilde who actually wrote a book that was in Bram's library that actually pointed Bram to the direction of the Irish folklore is very similar to that of Transylvania. And Madame Gerard, the Scottish writer, has done a bits and pieces on it. So she, Oscar Wilde's mother, actually helped Bram make this connection. He then takes that and goes and finds this book by the Scottish writer, who then gives him everything Bram needs to know about the similarities between Romanian and Irish folklore. And voila, we've got this sort of supernatural count pulled out of myth, but also originated in the realism of what he grew up in.
Absolutely. And I mean, I would probably go a little bit further, Dacre, and say that the world that he sprang from, a particular subset of Dublin life in the 19th century, was sort of saturated with this sort of stuff. You had the wilds and the folklore and the Celtic revival that was going on, obviously the kind of W.B. Yeats with that sort of mysticism and romanticism as well, which was in the background. But you also had people like Sheridan Le Fanu, who lived, I think, probably across the square from Stoker or his family, or in that realm. And he is often overlooked, but he was one of the founders of the modern ghost story. And of course, he wrote the very famous vampire tale, Camilla. So all of this is swirling around in the world that your ancestor was in. However, Dacre, answer me this. I get all this, and I get this kind of cauldron that he emerges from, this Gothic cauldron. However, this is a man who goes through education, goes to Trinity, it's a very traditional sort of route, and joins the civil service, and spends his time writing about the petty sessions in Ireland or whatever it happens to be, which in retrospect looks to be the most dullest course of action he could have taken. Why so?
Well, I think what happened, being child number 3 in the family, his father retired, somebody needed to earn an income.
Right.
And Bram was that chosen one. He was the right place, the right time, graduating from Trinity. Dad retires. He does have a pension, but his father directs him to this job. And it's a steady job. But it also satisfies that side of Bram's brain, who's got a master's in mathematics from Trinity, to get things right. This is something about Bram that I discovered in the Lost Journal, that he not only noticed things in the world around him that were not right or could be helped, he had a duty to do something about it. And that's one thing he did when he became the inspector of the clerks of petty sessions all over Ireland. He realized things were not as codified and consistent as they should be in all the counties throughout Ireland, which, that could be expected back in the mid-1800s. What did Bram do about it? His boss said, well, Stoker, what are we going to do? I need to make a manual. So Bram, on his own time and his own dime, wrote the book, The Duties of Clerks of Petty Sessions, which shows that he really did care about unifying all these laws. Very boring, very dull, as you pointed out, but it was necessary. And I think that shows the type of man Bram was. And, he went on and did something very similar in the theater. He and Irving went to fix the theater, to elevate the role of the actors and actresses in the theater, that it would be a place where the actors got their lines right, wore the right clothing, the costumes, had the sets designed accurately, and it was very businesslike. So he took that sort of gene of his, moved it into his first job as the clerk, and then took it to his second job as the manager of the Lyceum Theatre. And it does resurface in his writings in minor ways. And that's, as I said, Harker getting all the legalities right, but then he sprinkles in sort of the mysteries of what people believed, the myth of the vampire, with real places, Whitby, Purfleet, Exeter, train schedules, all these things to create a sense of realism and order in life, but with the unorder of the supernatural. And so it's a way I think it would have been very satisfying for him to have people kind of scratch their head as he achieved this willful suspension of disbelief. Oh my gosh, this crazy story, just maybe it is real after all. And you know what, Seán? To this day, people are still searching out the paranormal, trying to understand if, the origin of the vampires was actually steeped in something real, or was it misunderstandings of beliefs of biological decomposition and such.
Well, yes, absolutely. But there's also increasing interest in Bram Stoker as the man who created this modern myth, and what lies in his psyche, what lied in his world that sort of bubbled up to the surface subconsciously or consciously. Because one of the things I think I'm right in saying, Dacre, is that your famous ancestor was a man who loved puzzles, cryptograms. He loved sort of codes and codifying. And I wonder if, is that in your research of him as a young man, I mean, obviously there's a mathematical background, but was that something you came across, this idea that he kind of enjoyed that idea of concealing truth behind certain codifications?
Unfortunately, there's very little within the family, consciousness of those types of stories. There is, Bram has a line that's still alive, and there's great grandsons that were actually raised by Bram's son because their father died in World War II. So I do have some direct links to living people that will tell me stories as they remember their grandfather telling them that Bram had suffered nightmares as a child. Bram liked puzzles. Bram would bring home coins from his trips around Europe, around America with the Lyceum Theater, and he would then place the coins and have his son Noel arrange the coins and remember the history of the people on the coins. So when he could remember them all in the right sequence, they could get things. He brought back to his son train ticket stubs. His son, interestingly enough, became a chartered accountant with that sort of math side of Bram's brain, but also that detail-oriented side of things that Bram also had. Actually, funnily enough, the great-grandsons also became chartered accountants because they had that sort of mathematic gene to get things right and to do things right. So that seems to be a part of Bram that was very strong and is still, alive to this day. And it does speak to us a little bit about what kind of guy this was as we observe him, because unfortunately, there's nothing that he has said to us about what kind of a person. I have to get that by reading letters and reading what other people said about them and trying to cross-reference and coming up with my own version.
Now, before we leave Dublin, we have to mention a very important event which happened in his life, and that was that he got married, and he married somebody from a particular background who had literary links herself.
Florence Balcombe had a military link as well, which I think is probably one of those things that stuck with her later on in her life, that sort of order and purpose. She also loved the stage, which was an attraction to Bram, who married her to sort of move off to London to manage the Lyceum Theater. And she also had a pre-existing relationship with Oscar Wilde, who obviously had a literary background, stage and speaking background. So I think she was well aware of the life she was getting into. And many people sort of think, she played second fiddle to Bram. I don't think so. She was a strong woman, as we later found out when she actually took on Prana Films with the help of the Independent Society of Authors. So she was the right type of young lady to start off with Bram, to start a whole new life, moving to London, which was not easy for two Irish people at the time. Well, Henry Irving, was an up-and-coming actor, and he came to Dublin to play Hamlet. Bram Stoker, while he was a clerk in the Petty Sessions Legal Department, was sort of exercising his creative side by offering to write theatrical reviews to the Dublin Evening Post that, funnily enough, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, the author of Carmilla, was the editor of. And so they struck a deal. Bram gets to write theatrical reviews, which is another way of Bram making things right, to allow the patrons of theaters to get a look at what was on stage, and also for the people who were running the plays to figure out what they can do better. And of course, Bram writes a glowing review of Irving. Irving wants to meet this young man who thinks so highly of him. They end up having a wonderful evening, a long evening of all sorts of libation and discussions about life in general and the future of the theater at the Shelburne Hotel. And as we say, the rest is history. Within 2 years, Irving has leased the Lyceum Theater and offered Bram the job to come and help him manage it. And those skills that we talked about in the earlier show, Bram having the mathematics background, the legal background, the creative side of him, was the perfect match to be sort of the 2IC, the second in command to Irving. But it was also interesting to note the relationship that really fostered over the next 27 years, Seán, and that Bram knew his place. Irving was the star, but Bram helped him really invent method acting, both on and off the stage. He helped recreate Irving in the role that made him a pop star of the day. He was a massive star on the stage. They both sort of revolutionized the way the theater worked, to the point where the royals would come and everybody in between. It was the place to be, the Lyceum Theater. It got so popular that they traveled to America 8 times as well over these years, and they sold out everything along the way. So this was really a defining meeting at the Shelburne that changed Bram's course of life. It also put him in the center of the literati, where he could actually get his writing career, which was a side show, so to speak, a side hustle, as they say nowadays, that he could do mostly on his summer holidays. But it really moved Bram and Florence on in the direction that they wanted to go.
And this is a well-worn, well-documented tale, and it kind of just springs from Dublin over to London, and then the dizzy heights of the theatre world, and you're absolutely right. It's a kind of it's akin to some of the sort of rock star tales of our own time. But answer me this, Dacre, in all your research and all your writing, what do you make of that initial meeting between Irving and Bram? I mean, given what we know about Bram's background, which was steady as she goes, he was a civil servant, he was earning a crust for the family, he was making things right. It was a huge leap to leave not just everything, but to leave Dublin, Ireland behind and go to London with this actor who he had just met. What's your take on their actual meeting that night, and what do you think really convinced Bram to make the move?
I'm so glad you've asked that. Not many people do, because it really was a watershed moment. When you look at, as I have closely, Bram's siblings, three of them were scientists, all doctors, my great-grandfather being one of them, and all very successful. The two sisters being artists and trained in the arts, and the other was a civil servant, Thomas. And yet Bram was the one almost black sheep, that he was the creative, the writer, the athlete, the successful student, and dabbled in civil service. But when he broke away to go to the arts, he actually received a letter from his father warning him against that. And it was, to me, it was sort of a sad moment that Bram himself, especially in those days, to go against the will of his father, to take this leap, to follow his instinct. As people nowadays, hear this mantra, follow your heart, everything will fall in place. That was a really big step for Bram Stoker to do that. The theater was nothing like it was today. So he was actually taking a big risk, not sort of a upward move. The potential was there. Bram saw it. The dreamer in Bram saw that move upwards, but most other people in the family didn't. And I'm sure it was difficult for Bram. And there was obviously, I'm sure, some conflict within the family of doing it. But by golly, he did it. Almost, I think, to sort of prove them wrong. Sometimes that gives you great gumption to go and do something to prove the rest of them wrong. But he did keep, good relationships with the mother and his other brothers. Actually, his oldest brother, Thornley, helped him with the medical parts of Dracula, and his youngest brother, my great-grandfather, lived with Bram for a while he was going through his medical training. So he wasn't completely ostracized by the family to make this move. His father died not very long after, and Bram was the only one that managed to get to Cava di Terrini near Naples, Italy, to bury him and make sure all the details were done correctly. But as you pointed out, it was a huge move at the time, and I think that was a big risk and probably created a lot of consternation within the family to do so. But by golly, you look back at it and thank goodness he did.
Yes, I mean, the overriding characteristic for both Bram and Florence is one of courage, that they are prepared to leave everything behind on something which, as you've alluded to, Dacre, could have been an absolute sort of wild goose chase going absolutely nowhere. Actors in the theatre were not as reputable as Stoker and Irving would make them in due course. But let's leave aside the as I say, it's well documented and it was very successful, his time in London in the theatre world with Irving. They were the stars of the show. Let's sort of then pivot off to his most famous creation, Dracula, because let's talk a little bit about his writing before that. He did do quite a bit of writing before Dracula came along.
Yeah, he started writing some short stories that got published. They were a bit of a sort of a mystical element to them. He wrote The Snake's Pass, which actually, I believe, having analyzed it and having traveled in Ireland, was based on his travels to County Cork as the Inspector of Petty Sessions and certain things that happened. Again, Brahms would see real things, and hear of real people and then fictionalize them to make the stories a little juicier, obviously. So when he got to London and he had time on his hands, sort of earlier in the day, obviously the second half of the day was all busy with the theater, but also during his holiday time, I found specific references to a holiday in Whitby where he went in 1890. He went to the library. They've luckily been able to catalog the books he checked out, the books he looked at, the room in the Royal Hotel that he went to, the reading room when he was sort of sent off from Mrs. Vesey's guest house on Royal Crescent so the place could be cleaned. We know he found Vlad Dracula in a book by William Wilkinson. We know that name, Dracula, resonated to him because it was referenced as the devil, and the occult was a big thing at the day. This whole concept of religion versus science was a big deal. So his research in the Whitby Library, and then he came back to London and started doing his research in the British Museum Library, which then later became the London Library. We know the exact books that he looked at. We know that he sort of got great confidence by books by a medical doctor named Mayo, by scientists that were referencing vampirism, ghosts, actual scientific sort of concepts that volcanoes were the homes of the devil. And Bram simply took all of this realism, like I talked in the earlier show, but had it in these books while he was outlining his novel Dracula. And luckily we know that because he kept very good notes, 125 pages, that have ended up in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we've also seen the actual typescript of Dracula with the Paul Allen estate, one of the co-founders of Microsoft owns out in Seattle, Washington. So we can actually go back and look at the origin, starting at the typescript, what was taken out, what was added in, the notes, and then now that Philip Spedding found the notebooks in the London Library, the actual research books, we kind of have a really good idea what caught Bram's eye for writing Dracula.
Now, the process by which Dracula was created took many years. You've identified 1890. I think the book was published or the novel was published in 1898. There was a number of years of gestation before it finally became what we have today. One of the sort of criticisms that's been leveled at Bram for many years is that he did a lot of book research, but that he never actually visited Transylvania. Why do you think that was?
Well, back in the day, the Western world, the civilized world, sort of ended in Budapest, Hungary. I mean, it was very fancy, the fancy trains, but beyond that, farther east of that, was really the deep, dark, as they called it, land beyond the forest. And, it was sort of where the incursion of the Ottoman Empire over history had been coming in to sort of take over Christian Europe. It was really a mucky zone. And this was something that, luckily there were some travelers that went there. I mean, really adventurers. But lucky for Bram and the rest of us, they wrote books about it. Andrew Cross, Charles Bonner, Elizabeth Mattucelli, and others wrote books about their adventures in this land beyond the forest. And these books were in the London Library. So Bram didn't have to go any further than St. James Square, where he could get benefit from all this. I don't think, Seán, he actually had time to go off to Romania with all the things going on with the London Library. But we could Google nowadays. He went to the London Library and everything was at his fingertips.
Yes, I think people overlook the fact that, as you've said, in the modern parlance, Bram's writing was a side hustle. He had a full-time job, which was indeed a full-time job and something which preoccupied him with the tours that increasingly got very grand for Irving across North America and beyond. So it was maybe just a time issue. Let's look a little bit at what has intrigued a number of people in the last number of years, and that is the autobiographical elements within Dracula. I'm sure you're familiar with these, Dacre, and you've already alluded to the fact that in Bram's writings, he would often fictionalize real events. I think there was the famous episode where he dived into the Thames to try and save a drowning man, and that became a short story. And there were other examples of this. If that is the case, what do you make of Dracula? Where do you think the autobiographical threads are there?
Well, in addition to the feeling of somebody traveling to a far-off land, which was obviously been happening with the British Empire expanding all over the world, but a solo traveler like a Harker, specifically the young solicitor like Harker, which is very much like Bram, himself, you've got the concepts of Eastern European reverse colonization, which was an issue in London. People moving into, civilized London with, coming from countries that, people were not too excited about having them here. It's still going on to this day around the world. Refugees and so on, and people, we don't want to have these outsiders, these others here. It's what they bring with them. And what they bring with them is superstition and folklore and different living styles. And that tends to sort of, fry people's brain. Now, what happened was Bram was sort of making a statement here when at this time in civilization, we've got some of the most massive expansions of industry, science going on and one reason is Charles Darwin had just published Origin of the Species, which kind of changed the way the world was looking at religion versus science. They were wrestling with that. And what did Bram do? He inserted that in the story in a very autobiographical way, because I think that's how Bram Stoker felt about the wrestle between religion and science, and that we still need faith. This band of heroes that Bram put together was a cross-section of people Bram knew very well. And one of them was his brother, Dr. Seward, was no question. That was Thornley Stoker. And then the others were sort of amalgamations of different people. I think his mother was a little bit of Mina Harker, the modern woman. But if you take that and say, how will they react to the threat of something coming into this country that has a supernatural element to it? Can we use science to defeat it? Which is also Bram's three brothers, the scientist doctors. Can we use that? So what does he do? He brings in a person like Van Helsing, who I think Bram is looking at as a mighty soul who combines the understanding of the law, of education, and of science. Because Van Helsing is a professor, a lawyer, and a doctor. And so that guy is looking at the world at that time as Bram Stoker, I think, himself wants people to look at the world saying, we can solve these things. And as Bram quotes, there are mysteries in life which we may guess at, but only age by age solve them in part. And that is, open your mind, but science may be applicable, but it may not. And if it doesn't, we might have to look at superstition. And what's going to keep us together? The band of heroes having great faith. Faith in what? Not one specific religion, but a religion in general. And that's, I think Bram had shifted himself to pantheism later on in his life because he'd seen a lot of conflict with religion and specific religions, Protestant and Catholic conflict, obviously in Ireland, but around the world. So I think he had sort of drank the Kool-Aid that Walt Whitman probably fed him a little bit, is all religions are good, but faith is what's important. And that's what binded the band of heroes together against this unholy supernatural creature that we were now faced with. So I hope I made that clear, that there's a lot of Bram's own feelings, which is very typical of many authors, myself included, that get inserted into stories when you're trying to define what is the plot and what are the actual issues at hand that I'm trying to help the reader solve.
Now, it's very interesting what you're saying, Dacre, because it also fits with the other figure in the background of all of this was Henry Irving. I'm sure you're aware some authors have postulated that he was the model for Dracula, and the relationship between Bram and Irving was somehow dressed up in the novel. But also what's absolutely on record is that Irving was very much a Freemason and very much at the forefront of proselytizing for Freemasonry in the British Empire. Do you see threads of that in this pantheistic sort of almost sort of secretive world, again a world of codes and inside groups and folklore which is not understood by the masses? Absolutely.
Irving was a Freemason, as was Bram. Bram didn't practice it that much. I did actually get to look at an article written in a magazine that a guy in America who's very high up in Freemasonry sent me. And I think mostly because they said Bram was so busy at the theater, he didn't have time to advance in Freemasonry. But he was an open-minded person about many things. And if you think about spiritualism, his relationship with Arthur Conan Doyle and Mark Twain, he actually inserted a bit of Mark Twain, the spiritualist, into Dracula, where Mark Twain says in the one book that Bram Stoker helped Mark Twain get published is faith, believing in what you know ain't so, was in the Twain book. Bram Stoker said when Dr. Seward is trying to understand what Van Helsing's explaining about faith, he says, I once heard of an American so define faith as believing in things you know to be untrue. That's how I think what Bram Stoker himself believed in, and he inserted his good neighbor and good friend Mark Twain into the story. So this is, and as you mentioned, of the times, these are that sort of occultish issues that Van Helsing represents that Bram Stoker was very aware of. He also was very good friends with young Pamela Colman Smith, who was a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, who Bram brought in off the street, and she became a set designer. She also was the first artist to paint the Smith-Waite tarot cards. So all of these sort of mystical, secretive things were in Bram's consciousness. He let them come out by having the mystical sort of evil scientist, the evil spiritual creature of Dracula, bring him to life, so to speak, in a way that people could understand it.
Absolutely fascinating. I could go on for about another 2 hours on this, Dacre, but unfortunately the clock has beaten us. Now, you are the public face of the Bram Stoker estate, but that entails many different things. So tell people where they can find out more about the various initiatives you're involved in, and also where they can find out about your own writings.
Absolutely. So yes, I've written a prequel to Dracula called Dracula with J.D. Barker, sort of somewhat biographical of Bram, but fictionalized. A sequel to Dracula, Dracula the Undead with Ian Holt. They're all available on Amazon. The Lost Journal, The Dublin Years with Elizabeth Miller. That's available on Amazon as well. And then other books, Stoker on Stoker, sort of a handbook to the lectures that I give all over the world. So you can find all about that on either Amazon. Follow me on Facebook, Dacre Stoker Author, or Instagram. You can go to dacrestoker.com, the website, or follow me and what I do with my wife, promoting the estate, all things that is going on, interestingly enough, with the family and keeping Bram's intellectual property alive, bramstokerestate.com. And here's a freebie. If you want to read any of Bram's stories for free, bramstoker.org. Since most of it is in public domain, go check that out. And I'll give you one little tidbit to end on. Dracula's Guest is a wonderful short story. And on another show, we'll talk about how I have proof that it was once part of the original manuscript to Dracula. But that's a freebie. Read that on bramstoker.org.
I very much look forward to resuming this conversation. But for now, Dacre, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Always my pleasure, Seán. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.